That dog is a waste of time.
Sir, she's got a hit.
A full-bird colonel stood in front of his own convoy and said out loud in front of 24 soldiers that he didn't trust a dog to keep his men alive. 26 minutes later, that same colonel was standing on a dirt road with his hand raised in a salute, aimed not at another officer, but at a 60-pound Belgian Malinois named Saltline. If you love stories where the one everybody underestimates ends up saving everyone who doubted them, subscribe right now before we start. Because what this dog did on that road is the kind of thing veteran soldiers still talk about years later. And I want you playing along with me. The moment you think you know how many devices Saltline was about to find, drop your guess in the comments before we get there. Most people guess low, way low. Let's go back to the beginning, to a forward operating base in a region one won't name specifically for operational and privacy reasons, involving personnel whose identities have been altered in this retelling, to a briefing tent on a morning that started with tension already thick in the air. The convoy scheduled to roll out that day was carrying something the base commander, a colonel named Richard Voss, considered non-negotiable in terms of risk tolerance. A resupply run along a 14-mile stretch of road that intelligence reports had flagged just 2 days earlier as an area of increased insurgent activity. Increased activity on a road like that usually meant one thing: someone had been burying something in it. Standard procedure for a convoy facing that kind of threat assessment called for an explosive detection dog team to sweep the route ahead of the vehicles, checking culverts, roadside debris, and suspicious disturbances in the dirt that human eyes, moving at convoy speed, would never catch in time. The base had exactly one detection team available that morning, and that team consisted of a young handler, a staff sergeant named Elena Marsh, and her dog, a 2-year-old Belgian Malinois with a service record that, on paper, looked thinner than the colonel liked. Her call sign, if you could call it that, was simply the name on her tags, Saltline. Nobody ever fully explained where the name came from, and Marsh herself, when asked later, would only say it came from the breeder, and left it at that. Colonel Voss had been in command of that base for 8 months, and in that time, he had developed a reputation among the enlisted soldiers for being meticulous to the point of exhausting, a man who read every report twice and trusted almost nothing he hadn't personally verified. It wasn't paranoia, exactly. It was the kind of caution that comes from a man who had, earlier in his career, lost soldiers under his command to exactly the kind of threat that morning's convoy was rolling straight toward. He had earned his caution the hardest way there is. So when Staff Sergeant Marsh and Saltline arrived at the briefing tent that morning, ready to be assigned lead sweep position ahead of the convoy, Colonel Voss looked at the dog's file, looked at Marsh, who was noticeably younger than most handlers he'd worked with, and said the sentence that would follow him for the rest of that deployment. "I'm not betting this convoy on a dog with 6 months of field time and a handler who's never run a mission this size." The tent went quiet in the specific way tents go quiet when an officer says something a room full of soldiers privately disagrees with but has no intention of arguing against out loud. Marsh, according to 2 soldiers who were present that morning, didn't argue either. She simply said, "Understood, sir," and stood at attention, giving no indication of what she actually thought. Here's a question I want you to sit with while we keep going, and I actually want your honest take in the comments. Have you ever had someone in a position of authority dismiss you based on nothing but your resume, without ever actually watching you work? Because that's exactly where Marsh and Saltline stood in that tent, judged entirely on paper by a man who had never once seen them in action. What Colonel Voss didn't know, because it genuinely wasn't the kind of thing that shows up cleanly in a service file, was the specific and unusual history behind why Saltline had only 6 months of field deployment, despite being fully trained and certified nearly a year earlier. Saltline had actually completed her detection certification with exceptional scores, among the highest in her training class, according to records later reviewed by an investigative journalist who covered the story after the fact. But her deployment had been delayed for months due to a bureaucratic mix-up involving handler reassignments, a problem entirely unrelated to the dog's actual capability. Marsh had been assigned to Salt Line only 4 months before that morning's convoy, inheriting her from a previous handler who had been medically discharged. And in those 4 months, Marsh had thrown herself into building a working relationship with an intensity that impressed even the base's senior kennel master, a gruff master sergeant who didn't hand out praise easily, and who would later describe Marsh's bond with the dog as the tightest I've seen in 15 years of running these programs. What Colonel Voss also didn't know was that Salt Line had a specific detection specialty that made her, if anything, more suited to that particular road than almost any other dog on base. She had an unusually acute sensitivity to a specific class of explosive compound that had become increasingly common in improvised devices in that region over the previous year. Devices deliberately built with minimal metal content, specifically to defeat standard detection methods. Salt Line's trainers back in the certification program had flagged her scent discrimination on exactly that compound class as remarkable, unusually consistent, the kind of natural aptitude that can't fully be trained into a dog that doesn't already have the instinct for it. None of that was in the summary Colonel Voss had glanced at that morning. What was in it was a deployment gap that, on paper, looked like inexperience, and a handler whose age made her look, to a man who valued the appearance of seasoning, unready for the job. Despite his stated reservations, Colonel Voss didn't actually have another option. The base's second detection team was out on a separate mission that morning, and delaying the resupply convoy carried its own risks. A base further up the supply chain was running low on essential medical supplies, and further delay wasn't something command was willing to accept without strong justification. So, with clear reluctance, Voss authorized Marsh and Salt Line to run the lead sweep, but made a point of saying, loudly enough for the assembled soldiers to hear, that he would personally be riding in the second vehicle to observe. I want you to picture that moment for a second. A young handler and her dog, already dismissed once in front of a room full of people, now being told the colonel himself would be watching over her shoulder, essentially auditioning for the trust that should have already been given. Marsh, again according to soldiers present, didn't flinch. She loaded Salt Line into the lead vehicle, ran through her pre-mission checks with the same calm precision she used every day, and the convoy rolled out roughly 40 minutes later than originally scheduled, a delay that, in retrospect, everyone on that convoy would come to see as almost providential. The first 6 miles of the sweep passed without incident. Salt Line worked the road exactly the way she'd been trained, moving in a methodical pattern ahead of the lead vehicle, nose down, Marsh reading her body language with the practiced fluency of someone who had spent 4 months learning every subtle shift in her dog's posture. Colonel Voss, watching from the second vehicle through binoculars, said nothing, which several soldiers later described as its own kind of statement. At the 7-mile mark, Salt Line stopped. It wasn't dramatic. Dogs trained for explosive detection don't bark or lunge the way movies sometimes suggest. A properly trained detection dog gives a passive alert, sitting or lying down at the source of a scent, deliberately avoiding any behavior that might disturb the device itself. Salt Line simply sat, completely still, at the edge of a shallow drainage culvert that ran under the road. Marsh called the halt immediately, and the entire convoy stopped roughly 200 meters back, per protocol. An explosive ordnance disposal team, traveling with the convoy specifically for this possibility, moved forward to investigate the culvert Salt Line had indicated. What they found was the first of what would become 9 separate devices discovered along that 14-mile stretch of road that day. A pressure plate device buried at the culvert's edge, built with minimal metal content, exactly the kind of device Salt Line's unusual scent sensitivity had been flagged for back in her certification training. Colonel Voss, watching from the second vehicle, later admitted in an interview included in an after-action review that his first reaction wasn't relief, it was disbelief. quickly followed by the uncomfortable recognition that he had spent that entire morning arguing against the exact capability that had just potentially saved his convoy from its first casualty of the day. The road didn't get easier from there. Over the following 7 miles, Saltline alerted 8 more times, each alert confirmed as an actual device by the EOD team following behind her. The devices varied, some pressure plate triggers similar to the first, others remotely detonated, positioned at intervals that EOD analysts later concluded were deliberately designed to catch a convoy that successfully avoided the first few devices, essentially a layered ambush built to still succeed even against a partially effective sweep. 9 devices on a single 14-mile stretch of road, found by a dog that a colonel had less than an hour earlier called too inexperienced to trust. By the time the convoy reached its destination, word of what had happened had already spread through radio chatter to soldiers who weren't even part of the mission. 9 confirmed devices on a single sweep was, by any measure, an extraordinary outcome. The kind of number that gets flagged all the way up the chain of command. The kind of number that ends up in official reports read by people far above a single forward operating base. What happened next is the part of this story that soldiers who were there still bring up, unprompted, years later. When the convoy finally stopped at its destination and the vehicles began unloading, Colonel Voss walked directly to where Marsh was crouched beside Saltline, checking her over, giving her the specific praise and reward routine that detection dogs are trained to receive after a successful mission. According to 3 soldiers who witnessed the moment independently and whose accounts matched closely enough to be considered reliable, Colonel Voss stood at attention in front of the dog and rendered a formal salute. Not to Marsh, to Saltline. It's not, strictly speaking, official military protocol to salute a dog, and Voss himself reportedly acknowledged that with a slight, tired smile when a younger soldier pointed it out afterward. But nobody in that convoy needed the gesture explained to them. Everyone there understood exactly what it meant, and exactly what it was apologizing for, even though Voss never said the word sorry out loud, at least not that day. What he did say, according to Marsh's own account included in a later interview, was simpler, and in its own way more meaningful. He looked at her and said, "I was wrong about both of you. That won't happen again." And then he requested, formally, that Marsh and Saltline be assigned as the base's primary detection team for the remainder of his command, a request that, given what had just happened, nobody above him questioned for a second. The story of that convoy eventually made its way into official military publications focused on working dog programs, partly because 9 confirmed devices in a single sweep was a genuinely remarkable outcome worth documenting for training purposes, and partly, I suspect, because it's simply a story people wanted to tell. Saltline went on to complete a full deployment cycle with an exceptional record, and Marsh, once dismissed as too young and too inexperienced to be trusted with something this serious, became one of the most requested handlers on that base for the remainder of her deployment. What strikes me most about this story isn't really the 9 devices, remarkable as that number is. It's the 8-word sentence Colonel Voss said in that briefing tent that morning, the one about not betting the convoy on a dog and a young handler, and how completely, undeniably wrong that sentence turned out to be within a single mission. He wasn't a bad officer. He wasn't cruel. He was cautious, in a way his own experience had taught him to be, and that caution led him to judge 2 lives, one human, one canine, based entirely on paperwork, without ever giving them the chance to show him what a service record can't fully capture. So here's my question for you, and I really do want your honest answer in the comments below. Do you think Colonel Voss was wrong to hesitate in the first place, given what he knew at the time? Or do you think caution like his is exactly what keeps soldiers alive, even when it turns out to be misplaced in a specific case like this one? I've gone back and forth on this while researching the story because I think there's a real argument that his caution was reasonable, even though it happened to be wrong. Tell me where you land, and tell me honestly, did you guess 9 devices, or did you guess low like most people do? If this story kept you hooked, hit subscribe before you go, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. The ones everybody underestimates, right up until the moment they can't be underestimated anymore. And if you've got a story like this you want covered next, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.